In 1949, General Motors did something that would reshape American culture for the next 3 decades. They took a big, heavy engine designed for their premium Cadillac line and dropped it into a mid-priced Oldsmobile body. The result was the Rocket 88, the first true muscle car, and nobody at GM had any idea what they'd just created. The thing is, muscle cars weren't supposed to exist yet. The formula seems obvious now. Take a big engine, put it in a lighter car, sell it to regular people. But in 1949, that wasn't how the car business worked. Performance was for the wealthy. Speed was for racing. Regular Americans got reliable transportation. Maybe some chrome, if they were lucky. Oldsmobile changed that equation with one engine, and the automotive world would never be the same. To understand why the Rocket 88 mattered, you have to understand what American cars were in the late 1940s. The war had just ended. Factories that had been building tanks and aircraft were switching back to civilian production, and the cars they were building were essentially pre-war designs with minor updates, flathead engines, solid axles, technology that hadn't fundamentally changed since the 1920s. The flathead engine was the standard of the era, simple, reliable, cheap to manufacture, and completely maxed out in terms of performance potential. The design placed the valves beside the cylinders rather than above them, which created all sorts of problems when you tried to make serious power. The combustion chambers were inefficient. Heat dissipation was terrible, and the airflow was so compromised that no amount of engineering could squeeze much more out of the basic design. Ford had been running their flathead V8 since 1932. It made about 100 horsepower in its best form. That was considered adequate. Actually, that was considered pretty good. The average American car of the era made somewhere between 90 and 110 horsepower. Nobody was complaining. But some engineers at General Motors were looking at the problem differently. The question wasn't how to make the flathead better. The question was whether the flathead should exist at all. The answer came from a team led by Charles Kettering, GM's legendary head of research. Kettering had been pushing for overhead valve engine designs since the 1930s. The concept wasn't new. Overhead valves had been used in racing engines for decades. The technology placed the valves directly above the pistons in the cylinder head, which allowed for much better breathing and more efficient combustion chambers. The problem was manufacturing complexity. Overhead valve engines required more precise machining, more parts, and more sophisticated assembly. In an era when cost was everything, that complexity was considered a luxury only high-end cars could afford. Kettering didn't see it that way. He saw overhead valves as the future of the American automobile, and by 1946, he had convinced GM's leadership to let him prove it. The development program that followed was remarkably ambitious. GM assigned 2 separate teams to create new overhead valve V8 engines simultaneously. One team worked on what would become the Cadillac engine. The other worked on the Oldsmobile version. Both engines would share the same basic architecture, but each would be optimized for its specific application. The Cadillac team, led by engineers John Gordon and Harry Barr, focused on smoothness and refinement. Their engine would power GM's most prestigious brand. It needed to be powerful, yes, but it also needed to be civilized, quiet, sophisticated. The Oldsmobile team took a slightly different approach. Their engine needed to be powerful enough to justify the overhead valve complexity, but it also needed to be affordable enough to sell in volume. Oldsmobile sat in the middle of GM's brand hierarchy, not as prestigious as Cadillac, not as budget-conscious as Chevrolet. The engine needed to reflect that positioning. Both teams started with clean sheet designs. No carryover parts from existing engines, no compromises based on existing tooling. This was a rare opportunity to build something genuinely new. The Oldsmobile engine that emerged displaced 303 cubic inches. That's about 5 liters in modern terms. The compression ratio was 7.25 to 1. Not particularly high by today's standards, but aggressive for 1949. The bore was 3 3/4 inches. The stroke was 3 7/16 inches. These dimensions gave the engine a relatively short-stroke design, which allowed it to rev higher and breathe better than the long-stroke engines that dominated the era. The cylinder heads featured wedge-shaped combustion chambers with the valves arranged at an angle. This design promoted better fuel mixture swirl and more complete combustion than the flathead layout could ever achieve. The intake and exhaust ports were positioned for optimal flow, with smooth transitions that minimized turbulence. The bottom end was equally considered. A 5-main bearing crankshaft provided rigidity and smooth operation. The connecting rods were forged steel. The pistons were aluminum alloy, which reduced reciprocating mass and allowed the engine to rev more freely. When they fired it up for the first time, the Oldsmobile rocket engine produced 135 horsepower at 3,600 RPM. That might not sound impressive today, but in 1949 it was a revelation. 135 horsepower from a mass production engine. The Ford Flathead made 100. The Chrysler Straight 8 made 135, but from a larger, heavier, more expensive engine. The Rocket V8 delivered Cadillac-level power in an Oldsmobile-priced package. But here's where GM made the decision that changed everything. They could have put this engine in the full-size Oldsmobile 98, the flagship. The car that would have made sense from a brand hierarchy perspective. Instead, they also offered it in the smaller, lighter Oldsmobile 76 body. Well, technically, they called it the 88. A new model designation for a new era. The Oldsmobile 88 weighed about 3,500 pounds. That's nearly 500 pounds lighter than the 98. Same engine, less weight. The math was obvious, and the results were immediate. The Rocket 88 was fast, not sports car fast, not race car fast, but faster than anything else you could buy at an American dealership in 1949. 0 to 60 came in about 12 seconds. The quarter mile took around 18 seconds. Top speed was over 95 miles per hour. Today, those numbers seem quaint. A modern minivan is faster. But in 1949, nothing else on the road could touch it. Nothing else came close. The automotive press noticed immediately. Hot Rod magazine tested a Rocket 88 and declared it the fastest stock car they'd ever driven. Motor Trend was equally impressed. The combination of power, weight, and price created a new category that didn't have a name yet. But it was on the NASCAR circuits where the Rocket 88 truly proved itself. In 1950, Oldsmobile 88s won 10 of 19 NASCAR Grand National races. That's a dominant season by any measure. Drivers like Red Byron and Curtis Turner discovered that the Rocket engine gave them an advantage that skill alone couldn't overcome. When everyone's driving as hard as they can, the car with the most horsepower tends to win. In 1951, Oldsmobile won 20 of 41 NASCAR races. Another dominant performance. The other manufacturers were scrambling to respond, but they were working with outdated engine technology. The Flathead Ford couldn't keep up. The Chrysler Straight 8 was too heavy. The Rocket was simply better. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. The technical advantages of the overhead valve design went beyond just peak horsepower. The Rocket engine produced its power across a broader RPM range than competing engines. Torque peaked at 240 pound-feet at 1,800 RPM. That meant strong acceleration from a stop and plenty of passing power at highway speeds. The engine felt alive in a way that flathead engines simply couldn't match. The combustion efficiency also translated to better fuel economy than you might expect. The higher compression ratio extracted more energy from each drop of fuel. In normal driving, a Rocket 88 could achieve around 15 to 17 miles per gallon. Not impressive by modern standards, but competitive with smaller, less powerful cars of the era. Reliability was another advantage. The overhead valve design ran cooler than flathead engines because the combustion chambers were better positioned for heat transfer to the cooling system. The water jackets surrounded the areas that got hottest, which reduced hot spots and thermal stress. Owners reported that rocket engines would run for 100,000 miles without major work. At a time when 50,000 miles was considered a good engine life, that durability built brand loyalty that lasted for decades. The engineering team hadn't just built a faster engine, they'd built a better engine in almost every measurable way, and they'd priced it for the middle market. The competition's response was predictable. Every major manufacturer started crash programs to develop their own overhead valve V8s. Chrysler introduced their Hemi engine in 1951, a more radical design that placed the valves at opposing angles in hemispherical combustion chambers. The Hemi made 180 horsepower from 331 cubic inches, more power than the Rocket, but in a heavier car and at a higher price point. Ford finally abandoned the flathead in 1954, introducing their Y-block V8. Chevrolet followed in 1955 with the legendary small-block V8. By the mid-1950s, overhead valve engines had become the American standard. The flathead was dead, and Oldsmobile had fired the first shot. But the Rocket engine didn't stand still. Each year brought improvements. In 1950, displacement increased to 303 cubic inches and power climbed to 145 horsepower. By 1953, the engine had grown to 324 cubic inches and 170 horsepower. In 1957, the Rocket displaced 371 cubic inches and made 300 horsepower with the optional J2 setup featuring 3 two-barrel carburetors, 300 horsepower. From an engine you could buy at any Oldsmobile dealer, the performance numbers had nearly doubled in 8 years, and the price premium remained reasonable. This was performance for the masses, not just the wealthy. The formula that Oldsmobile pioneered became the template for the entire muscle car era. Take a big engine, put it in a mid-size car, sell it at a price that working people could afford. Pontiac did it with the GTO in 1964. Chevrolet did it with the Chevelle SS. Ford did it with the Fairlane and the Torino. Dodge did it with the Charger. Plymouth did it with the Roadrunner. Every one of those cars owed a debt to the Rocket 88. Every one of them followed the formula that Oldsmobile established in 1949. Big engine, lighter car, accessible price. The muscle car era was born in a GM engineering lab 7 years before most people knew it existed. The cultural impact went beyond just automotive engineering. The Rocket 88 became a symbol of American optimism and technological prowess. Here was tangible proof that American industry could produce something genuinely better than what came before. Faster, more powerful, more exciting, and available to anyone who could make the payments, musicians noticed. In 1951, Jackie Brenston and the Delta Cats released a song called Rocket 88. Many music historians consider it one of the first rock and roll records ever made. The song celebrates the car's power and speed, establishing a connection between automobiles and rebellion that would define American youth culture for decades. The car appeared in countless movies and television shows. It became the vehicle of choice for young men who wanted to prove something. Drag strips across America filled with Rocket 88s, their owners discovering that the engine's strong bottom end made it ideal for standing start acceleration. The aftermarket performance industry, which barely existed before 1949, suddenly had a platform worth modifying. Hot rodders discovered that the Rocket engine responded well to modifications. port and polish the heads, add a hotter camshaft, upgrade to multiple carburetors, and the engine would make 350, 400, even 500 horsepower. The basic architecture was strong enough to support serious performance work. Weekend mechanics could turn a daily driver into a genuine racing threat. The influence extended into professional racing as well. Beyond NASCAR, rocket-powered Oldsmobiles competed in the Carrera Panamericana, the brutal Mexican road race that claimed lives every year. In 1950 and 1951, Oldsmobiles dominated the event, demonstrating that the engine's performance advantages translated across different types of competition. The engineers who designed the rocket engine received well-deserved recognition. Gilbert Burrell, the chief engineer on the project, became known as the father of the overhead valve V8 at Oldsmobile. His team's work influenced engine design at GM and across the industry for the next 50 years. The basic architecture they created, a 90-degree V8 with overhead valves, pushrod actuation, and wedge combustion chambers, became the dominant American engine configuration. But perhaps the most significant legacy was philosophical rather than technical. The Rocket 88 proved that performance didn't require exotic engineering or astronomical prices. You didn't need a European sports car to go fast. You didn't need a racing background or specialized knowledge. You could walk into a dealership, buy a Rocket 88, and outrun almost anything on the road. That democratization of performance changed what Americans expected from their cars. Speed became an entitlement, not a luxury. Power became a selling point for mass-market vehicles. The performance wars that would define the 1960s started here, in 1949, with an engine that cost only slightly more than the flatheads it replaced. The production numbers tell part of the story. In 1949, Oldsmobile sold over 270,000 cars. The 88 models with the rocket engine were the best sellers. In 1950, sales climbed above 400,000. The rocket was pulling customers into Oldsmobile showrooms who had never considered the brand before. Young buyers, performance-oriented buyers, buyers who would have gone to Cadillac if they could afford it, but found what they wanted in the Oldsmobile instead. General Motors noticed. The corporation's leadership recognized that the rocket engine had created value beyond just unit sales. It had elevated the Oldsmobile brand. It had generated publicity that money couldn't buy. It had established GM as the technology leader in American automotive manufacturing. The lesson was clear: performance sells. That lesson would shape GM's strategy for the next 2 decades. Pontiac got permission to develop performance variants. Chevrolet invested in the small block V8 that would become the most successful engine in automotive history. The corporation's tolerance for internal competition increased. If Oldsmobile could build excitement with a hot engine, maybe other divisions could too. The original Rocket 88 remained in production through 1953, evolving each year with incremental improvements. By the time it was replaced with a larger, more modern design, the car had established a legacy that Oldsmobile would leverage for decades. The Rocket name stayed on Oldsmobile engines through 1990. 41 years of continuous use for a marketing term that actually meant something. Today, original Rocket 88s are sought after by collectors who understand their historical significance. A well-preserved 1949 or 1950 model can bring 6 figures at auction. But the real value isn't monetary. These cars represent a turning point in automotive history. The moment when performance became accessible, the moment when the muscle car era truly began. The factories that built rocket engines are closed now. Oldsmobile itself ceased to exist in 2004, a victim of General Motors' brand consolidation efforts. The Lansing assembly plant, where 88s rolled off the line, has been converted for other uses. The engineers who designed the original rocket have passed on. But the formula they created lives on in every modern performance car. Every time a manufacturer puts a powerful engine in a mainstream vehicle and sells it at an accessible price, they're following the template Oldsmobile established in 1949, the Dodge Charger, the Ford Mustang, the Chevrolet Camaro, all of them descendants of the Rocket 88, whether their manufacturers acknowledge it or not. Some surviving examples can still be seen at car shows and museums. The Henry Ford Museum has a well-preserved specimen. Various collectors maintain racing examples from the NASCAR years. And occasionally one will appear on the road, its owner demonstrating that 75-year-old engineering still turns heads. The sound is distinctive, a mechanical rumble that speaks of push rods and solid lifters and technology that predates electronics, not refined, not quiet, but honest in a way that modern engines with their variable valve timing and direct injection and turbocharging can never quite match. The Rocket 88 proved that you don't need exotic engineering to create something extraordinary. You need a good idea, competent execution, and the courage to challenge conventional wisdom. The engineers at Oldsmobile had all three. They didn't know they were creating the muscle car era. They were just trying to build a better engine. Sometimes that's how the biggest changes happen. Not through grand vision or deliberate revolution. Through engineers solving problems and discovering that their solution changes everything. That's the story of the Rocket 88. An engine that created a category, a car that defined an era, and a formula that automotive manufacturers are still following 75 years later. The first true muscle car, built by engineers who were just trying to make something better. And that's exactly what they did. So that's the Oldsmobile Rocket 88. Still can't believe GM essentially invented the muscle car by accident. If you've ever seen one of these in person, or worked on one, or heard one run, drop it in the comments. I'm curious what the experience is like now, all these decades later. And if you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. We do this every week.